Hello again, everybody. This is Dr. Lisa Love, and this is the continuation of the series of 10 evolutionary groups, How Humans Evolve is Understood by Alice Bailey. And this is Group 7, the Probationary Disciple. And this is an introductory video. So as I start out with, in every single one of these videos, there are 10 evolutionary groups in general, which are divisions attempting to show how humans progress from their baser animal instincts, where they are focused mainly on surviving and procreating, to the point where they know who they are as spiritual beings and live accordingly. And according to Bailey, humans of all 10 groups are said to exist among us. Those in the first 6 groups are primarily focused on becoming human. Groups 7 and 8, which we start on in this particular series, are becoming soul, and groups 9 and 10 are focused on becoming spirit. Those are the 3 main stages. And just to recapitulate, in the previous videos, we have focused on those which are involved in the first stage of becoming human, or what Bailey calls becoming the integrated personality, who are on the path of individuation. And those include her groups 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Who are focused primarily on the realm of the 5 senses. You get up, you look out in the day, and whatever it is that you see, hear, taste, touch, and smell is what you are engaged in. And your thoughts are engaged in that outer external world as well. You are also focused on gaining sufficient mastery or manipulation of the body, emotions, and mind for purpose of exploiting the outer world or external world of the 5 senses. And you have very little mastery at group 1, and you have excessive mastery of this at group 6. There are videos on all of those groups that I invite you to watch. But in general, those groups are focused on what we call the emotional plane, or the plane of karma. I'm going to get my little pointer here, and you can see those words here. Or the astral plane, which essentially means the emotional plane, or karma plane of desire. That word means desire. So most of humanity for a very long time has been engaged for thousands, maybe even millions of years within the emotional plane. And as I just said, the 6 groups have their focus there. And they represent the process of becoming fully human, or what Bailey calls becoming the integrated personality. Now, I have taken, you see these little triangles here, and made them one big triangle. And you see this line right here. That is the line that has to do with the integrated personality all the way through group 6, where it is primarily selfish and separative. As we get into this level, see how the personality bracket goes all the way up to here where these dotted lines are? As we get into this level, we're getting into group 7, and I'm going to explain what that means in a moment. So the personality triangle that I have drawn goes all the way up to these dotted lines, or they do in this particular version of it, which you can't really see. But the groups 1 through 6 are focused primarily on this section of it. They're also completing the last stage of the path of individuation, where the focus is on understanding that you are a unique human being separate from others. And as I said before, that process begins at group 1. And we had in that video where the recapitulation, because all human beings go rapidly through these processes, these previous stages. And so most human beings go through the recapitulation of group 1 around 18 months. And you can do that in what's known as the Rouge test, where a young child before that age will look in a mirror and not know that that's who they're looking at, themselves as a separate individual in the mirror. And if you put a spot of rouge on their forehead, they'll look in that mirror and they won't know that they have a spot of rouge on their forehead. Well, somewhere about 18 months, the child will go through this initial process of group 1 and wake up and individualize and understand that that is themselves in the mirror, and they have a spot of rouge on their forehead that they'll attempt to get rid of. Some animals also have gone through this process, but for the large part, the majority of animals have not. And that represents the beginnings of becoming human. You're something else besides human before then. But that is the beginnings of becoming human, and that is where group 1 kicks in. Group 6, we're going to go through again in a moment in this video in a really fast way, because this video is primarily focused on an entirely new stage that represents a radical shift. They're going into the second stage of what I call becoming soul, and Bailey calls becoming the soul-infused personality, and they are now on what Bailey calls the path of initiation. So this is a big deal. This is like a giant leap in human consciousness when you start to enter this level in the Bailey model. And we're going to look in this video at group 7. Group 8 is also a part of that process, but we're not yet into that video. So as group 7 emerges, we're told, again, they represent that radical shift. Why? Because they're focusing beyond the realm of the 5 senses. They're no longer involved, as we will see, in just simply what goes on out there. And they're no longer involved in just the realm of desire in the external world. They are now on the path of initiation, which is also in the Bailey books referred to as the path of purification. They are attempting to gain insight into and consciously understand and purify or spiritualize primarily their body and their emotions. Later, they're going to do that more with the mind, but right now there are just initial attempts to understand and spiritualize the mind. That means they're just beginning to introspect in that phase starts a little bit at the group 6 aspirant, but mainly in terms of how can I get a happy relationship? How can I use the law of attraction to get my desires met? It's not at the level that we're starting here, as we will see in group 7, where we're really starting to introspect and understand and observe the mind and thought itself. For example, they're trying to understand how thought works. Well, first of all, what are they thinking? How thought works, and also how their thoughts have been conditioned along certain lines of thinking. And as we'll start to see in this video and videos to follow, those in group 7 are especially pulled now between the outer world and the inner world. They're attempting to be in the world while not of it, though they don't do that real successfully yet. So they are beginning a major shift from the emotional plane onto the mental plane. That's pretty radical. And they're said by Bailey to have very few people on Earth that are in group 7. When she was around, she wrote that their numbers were in the thousands. Now she says not specifically 10,000, 100,000, 800,000, she doesn't say, but she does indicate that in the decades to come, especially in this century, they will be in the millions. Now in the low millions, but in the millions. And I think that's an interesting thing, because if you look at when Bailey wrote around the 1910s to the 1940s, about 100 years ago, there weren't a whole heck of a lot of people interested in this kind of stuff. Now I think it is reasonable to say that there is in the low millions. I mean, look at the apps on meditation, look at the predominance of people interested in yoga, etc. There certainly has been an explosion, and I think that's interesting because in some ways this to me is a prediction that has come true. Group 7 also starts the process of becoming the soul-infused personality, where the highly individualistic personality that functions in the outer world is increasingly being infused with soul values and soul consciousness. So I'm going to go back to this personality triangle here, because what's happening is this group on the mental plane is increasingly reaching up to this thing here known as the egoic lotus or the soul. And so as you slowly are moving up to try and become aware of the soul and its consciousness and its value system, You are also attempting to infuse your personality or individuality with those soul values and consciousness. Now, one of the things I like about the Bailey system is they distinguish between personality and individuality. In her model, and this is actually how a lot of people did it about 100 years ago, they used the word ego as equivalent to soul. Why? Because that was the soul infused, individualized self. Now we use ego primarily as what she would call the personality, which is selfish and separative and highly individualistic and focused primarily on its own needs, which include primarily power, pleasure and sex, money and security. But that is shifting as you start to get into here. And yet at group 7, this is just an initial process of understanding what this egoic lotus or soul is. And it's still a long ways away from truly being the personality in terms of that individualized self being infused with soul values and consciousness. They're also starting the path of initiation. And it's said that group 7 will complete the first initiation as part of their developmental process. And we'll have a whole video on that later, but you're going to get a little hint of that in this video. Now, there are 6 kinds of mind, and I have a whole video on this, so it's not my idea here to re-go over everything. I am trying to give you a little bit of a recapitulation, because if you're new to this video and you just dived into the Bailey model here, this will help you get a handle on it. And B, even if you've watched my other videos, it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of a recap so we understand where we are before we know the next step of where we're going. So essentially, there are 6 kinds of mind. And on the emotional plane, we have instinctual mind, a lower concrete mind. Most Bailey students aren't aware that there's a lower concrete mind on the emotional plane, and a personality mind. And especially as we get group 1 and 2 is primarily here, group 3 and 4 is moving here, 5 and 6 is here, and 6 is pretty well anchored here. But in group 7, as we're becoming the soul-infused personality, we're moving on to the mental plane. And there are 3 kinds of mind on the mental plane. And it's my hypothesis, Bailey did not say this, that group 7 is residing right around in here on the mental plane. They are on the plane of the lower mind. That doesn't mean that they don't get some hits from what's called the plane of the solar angel, where the soul, or egoic lotus, is. It just means that they're primarily residents of consciousness. I propose, and I believe I can substantiate with her ideas, is here in this particular level, which if you're counting from below, there are 7 subplanes, would be about 7th and 6th and subplane. And I actually have the other aspect of group 7, which I'll talk about in a moment, on the 5th subplane and maybe a little bit into the 4th subplane here. Anyway, in terms of her levels of mind, group 7 is primarily on the lower concrete mind on the mental plane. And it's important to understand that distinction. And they are also moving into what she calls son of mind. And that's another reason I argue that they're down here, using the lower concrete mind here, and just slowly moving their way up here, because this is also where the abstract mind is. But let's take a little bit of a look at some of that. So for example, there's the plane of the lower mind. On the plane of the lower mind, we have the concrete mind is beginning to observe the inner worlds. Remember, group 7 is shifting you inward, whereas on the emotional plane, the concrete mind is observing the facts of the outer world. And they're 2 different things, as we're going to see. And that's why I think Bailey has in her model the lower concrete mind here and the lower concrete mind here. This is concrete mind on the emotional plane, is where she puts it, about outer world concrete facts versus inner world concrete realities. How come they're concrete? Because they become concrete thoughts. But that's the thing, it's more about thoughts as something concrete. Then here it's more about what we observe with the five senses out there in the outer world. Now by group 6, who is the integrated personality, they're now immersed in and highly attached to the outer world through their concrete mind and their personality mind, we would also call it in our model. That means you get up and what is your day all about? What is the contents of your consciousness all about? It's all about stuff. How can I get more power? How can I manipulate people so I have more power? How can I have more influence in the world for better or worse? How can I get my sex needs met? I can go off to Jeffrey Epstein's island if you really want to. At this level, you could afford to. You could get all the sex that you want with whoever you want and get away with it because you can hide it and cover it up because you can use money to buy people off. You get all the security that you want and all the money that you want. When you reach group 6, you get it all, for better or worse. And there's a big temptation there. And I still haven't done my videos on the dark and light side of group 6. I will get to that. I just got interested in group 7 and went into this first here. But there is a light side that is trying to use that power and sex and pleasure and money and security for good in the world. And there is a group that is using it for bad in the world. Remember, this is the path of individualization. For better or worse, you are wanting to be an individual. And this is a big shift that we're going to take a look at here. But let me also talk about the abstract mind, which is up here. And a confusion that a lot of Bailey people have about the model they use is that we have abstract mind on the emotional plane. I've talked about that in other videos. Go look at that. There we're using the abstract mind to solve questions like, hey, I wonder what it would be like to live life on Mars someday, or what will I look like 20 years from now? What do I want to be when I grow up? That involves abstract thinking. And ask any psychologist, a 12-year-old, just about every 12-year-old on the planet has that. But Bailey says that the cream of humanity is group 6 and she indicates that it's on the emotional plane. So we can't be meaning something way up here in her model if the majority of humanity has it and is actually functioning in what she says groups 4 and 5, immersed in the middle section of the emotional plane. So what are we talking about when we're looking at the abstract mind on the mental plane after we go through what she calls son of mind? We are looking at how do I abstract or absorb personality tendencies so they're burned up in the consuming fire of God, allowing me to be a demonstration of God as love. That doesn't mean that you don't have a lot of abstract thinking going on. You're involved in the inner realms here. But that approach in abstract thinking is far different than what it would look like with the average 12-year-old using abstract thought as measured by most psychologists here. So we have to get prepared for these big, big leaps in focus and orientation as we move into group 7 and shift onto a whole nother way of being. Now, to let you know, there are a lot of books that Alice Bailey wrote, and they have a lot to say about group 7. In fact, I've read all of these books, most of them 4 or 5 times. A lot of them are in tatters. I've read them so much. And sometimes I wonder why. Why did I spend so much of my life doing this? Obviously, it was part of my dharma. But anyway, her books primarily are talking about group 7 and group 8 and a little bit about the other groups, but mainly group 7. So it's impossible for me to condense into even 5, 6, 7 videos, which I may do, who knows, on group 7. All she has to say in these books, I can't do it. So you're going to get a overview here. So basically, I've already kind of said groups 7 and 8 are mainly in these books, and that's also known as Probationary Disciples and Accepted Disciples. And she's talking about how those 2 groups develop spiritually on the path of initiation, what that path of initiation is like. Initiation is like an enlightenment experience. She also shares the potential pitfalls those in these groups face. And that's mainly the reason I got involved. I have a psychology background. I'm strongly immersed in different fields of psychology. I have some experience in transpersonal and integral and traditional psychology, but ever since my 20s, I got attracted to these books and I just never stopped being into them because I feel they have so much to share. And I still think it's amazing. And I have a whole video on Bailey and her connection to the other fields of psychology. Again, this woman started writing her very first book before women even had the vote. Women were extremely oppressed. And the field of psychology was newly emerging. And she and Carl Jung knew of each other. And Freud's big deal about super ego, and id. I even had to be psychoanalyzed once as an intern in my undergraduate program. So I'm familiar with Freud's views and most of the psychology views, Adler, Gestalt, etc. But my mind has still consistently been blown away. It still is blown away by how a woman that wrote 100 years ago, and a woman, that's the little feminist in me, could write so much about a field of psychology when the competition around her was Freud's superego, ego, and id, and the beginning emergence of Carl Jung. To me, she's pretty incredible. And that's why I'm sticking with this model and trying to help people understand it so that we can get a better handle on what it is that she was trying to put forward. Let's go for it. Group 7. So before I get into the specifics, as I have in every video, I want to start with her exact words about Group 7. And to let you know, in the other videos, I've documented everything I've said with Bailey quotes. I'm not doing that in this video. I will do it in the videos to come. This is an introductory video. I'm just trying to give you an overview of what we're going to be looking at, because as I've shown you, it's just too extensive when we get to Group 7. So starting out with her general overview of it, she states, they are those souls whose sense of awareness on the physical plane is now of such an order that they can pass on to what she calls the probationary path, which is also the path of purification, on the path of initiation. Back to her quote, they are mystics, conscious of duality, torn between the pairs of opposites, but who are yet unable to rest until they are polarized in the soul. They are sensitive, struggling people who long for release from failure and from existence in the world today. Their mind natures are alive and active, but they cannot yet control them as they should. And the higher illumination remains as yet a joyous hope and final possibility. So I want to highlight a few words here. First of all, this group tends to be mystics. What does that mean? They are engaged in a sense of duality between the external and the internal world. And we're going to see this as a really big theme in her Group 7. And also in terms of the problems that she addresses quite extensively in her books that this group faces as they're torn between those two worlds. Makes sense. You've spent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 groups, humanity being there for how many thousands of years. Even if you're in Group 7, you're doing a recapitulation in your life. And as you know, Bailey had that idea of recapitulation. Rudolf Steiner also took it up, but Bailey had that in her books as well, that we re-go through as we get born the previous stages we've accomplished. And basically, you know, so it's hard. This is a big thing. I can speak from experience. It's hard when you grow up and you know, you can feel like a misfit on this planet. Everybody else is into things you're not into. And as a kid, you're trying to fit in junior high and high school or college, whatever you're trying to do there. And you are recapitulating some of these things where, yeah, you know, it's all about the outer world and the goodies you can get out there. But inside, there's something in you that's saying it doesn't fit, doesn't feel right. And so that pull can already begin if you're recapitulating it fairly young for those coming in group 7. They are sensitive. Why? Because they're getting more sensitive to the inner realms. You are seeing and feeling and sensing things beyond what the external world is showing you. And yet you're struggling because you don't understand what all of that is. That's a beginning quest for group 7. What is all of this internal stuff? And we're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit more in this video and in videos to come. And there's also a sense of failure. Why? Because the things that everybody else is excited about. Remember, most of humanity is in what Bailey calls groups 4 and 5, striving to be like those group 6 people that get it all, you know, for better or worse. And group 7 people are like, it doesn't quite fit for me. Some of it may, and they may try some of that on, or they may recapitulate some of it and get all that wonderful goodies and then go, yeah, at some point. And we're going to look at that too. But this is a big deal for group 7 and a lot of what they're struggling with. And their mind natures are alive and active because they tend to be pretty intelligent, even if they're sensitive, you know, but they're got problems there too, which we'll go into, because they can't control that mind nature. They don't understand that inner world enough. They tend to distort it. They get lost in it. They're trying to observe their thoughts, maybe with some mindfulness practice, but they don't really yet control their thoughts. They're just starting to understand the conditioning. But that higher illumination remains as yet a joyous hope and final possibility. So there's this inner striving, I almost want to say necessity, to keep going. Because why necessity? From my own experience, is because you can't help but sense this stuff. You can't help but feel, no, there's something else. And so you just have to keep going as you try and figure all of that out. So that's the general overview by Alice Bailey. Now, remember, before we get to group 7, there was group 6, and I've kind of already talked about this. There are 2 groups that I've broken it into. She did not do this, I did it, but I have shown in my other videos, and I'm perfectly justified in doing this when you look at a lot of her different material and compile it together. So there's the stage 1 materialist, and then there is the stage 2 aspirants. The stage 1 materialist tend to be intelligent by society standards. Group 6 is the cream of humanity. They're the emerging group. Group 7's also coming in, but a lot less of them than group 6. And so it makes sense that most of humanity, groups 4 and 5 and group 3, look up to group 6. They want to be like group 6 and have all that power and pleasure and sex and money that they want. And the aspirants are using that in a more humanitarian and better way than the materialists are. And both of these reach the apex of being what she calls an integrated personality, which involves an inward and outward integration. This is important as we get into group 7, even though this is a recapitulation from my group 6 videos. The integration within has to be regarded as an essential step prior to passing in full and awakening consciousness into the 5th or spiritual kingdom. You start to pass into that 5th or spiritual kingdom as you get into group 7, the kingdom of conscious souls. You can't get there in a healthy way unless you have gone through the essential step of becoming an integrated personality. This is very important from a spiritual psychology point of view, because Alice Bailey talks a lot about the cleavages or gaps, her word cleavages, my word gaps, of development that happen if we don't do these steps in a healthy way. So this is a necessary step. The many parts form one whole, working under the direction of the intelligent conscious thinker, which is the soul, as far as the man is concerned. And that's a direct quote. And what is that integration? It means the mind, the emotions, the vital energy body, the physical body are all coordinated in such a way you can get pretty much anything you want in the external world. That's going to be important to understand, because the group 7 person can really struggle with and reject the idea of being confident in the external world. And there's reasons for that we'll go into later. But part of the necessary process is not only integration within, but integration without. Another quote, at the same time, this conscious form is slowly arriving at a point where integration is existing not only inwardly, but into the larger whole, carried forward progressively by the gradual integration of the part into the family unit, the nation, the social order, the current civilization, the world of nations, and finally into humanity itself. Remember, by group 6, you have a kind of global consciousness, for better or worse. Group 7, you're much more sensitive. You have that global consciousness. But it's also expanded beyond what you see externally to what you're experiencing internally. But here's the difficulty. You can't just skip over group 6. And the big problem for group 7, which we'll see, is escapism. You can't just escape the outer world. They'll try and they may do it. Because the idea isn't just to escape the outer world and be absorbed in the inner worlds. It's to be effective at some point as a soul-infused personality in the outer world. And that is why this is a necessary step. So when we get into group 7, we're getting into the Chela stages. It actually started with group 6 Aspirant, which is part of little Chelaship. That's something I have put together from coordinating all of her different terms. She has so many terms it actually makes me a bit nuts. It's not how I would have set the system up. I would have made it a lot more clean. But this is the model that I'm dealing with. And these Chela stages are essentially, the word Chela means spiritual student. And she has 6 stages. And they are little Chelaship, Chela in the light, accepted disciple, Chela on the thread, Chela in the aura, and Chela in the master's heart. Now, group 6 has part of the little Chelaship stage as the aspirant. And then it goes into group 7, which we'll see is comprised of 2 Chela stages that I believe, as I've compiled her material, little Chelaship, the probationary disciple, and Chela in the light, the accepting disciple. Those are here and here. We'll come back to those in a moment. To let you know, the first stages of little Chelaship is made up of the 2 substages, aspirants in group 6, probationary disciples in group 7. And as a reminder, little Chelas, which she says this is the most difficult of the 6 stages, the little Chelaship stage, have as their main goal breaking the hold that the physical world and 5 senses in the realm of desire has upon them. What does that look like? It means that you are increasingly conscious of the hold that your physical body, brain, and material desires have on you. You're struggling with, how do I get mastery over this physical body and the addictions or compulsions? How do I understand it's an interiorization? The inside of the physical body, the inside of the brain mechanism, and especially group 6 aspirants doing that more and more, but still in a materialistic kind of way, predominantly. The material desires still have a hold even on the aspirant stage of little Chelaship. They're starting to break it. So they're a good humanitarian in the outer world. And as we said in that group 6 aspirant video, they may be meditating a little, maybe going to counseling and doing a little introspection so they can have a better relationship, etc. But they're not really doing what we're going to see as group 7 stuff yet. The little Chela is also trying to break through that hold by learning to mentally and scientifically keep the physical body, brain fit, flexible, and fed in a way that keeps it vital and strong. And I think it's interesting because millions of group 7 and is supposed to be coming in, and group 6 is the next stage humanity's striving towards. And we see little Chelas, the aspirant and the probationary disciple, getting increasingly obsessed with things like hatha yoga. And in fact, Bailey even talks about that I'll bring up those quotes again. I did in a previous video on group 6, where she says this stage will recapitulate with group 7 and the little chelas, that they will, be obsessed again about the body the way we were a long time ago when humanity was just beginning to become humans and we're just learning to coordinate the bodies. Now we're doing it again in a way to try and spiritualize that physical body. But at first, the motive is to help satisfy one's desires. I'm going to look hot in my yoga pants and my hatha yoga class. I'm going to be there to check out the other people and see who looks good and who doesn't. And, I'm going to look good so I can get the attention of the media and all that kind of stuff. The motives are kind of iffy, especially at the little Chelaship aspirant stage. They're starting to clean up a little more at the little Chelaship probationary stage. But to get through the stage, you've got to shift the motive away from what's in it for me because I look hot and I get to be a spiritual leader or guru and I get to attract a lot of followers. Doesn't mean you can't look hot. Doesn't mean you can't attract a lot of followers or be a spiritual guru. It's just the motive inside is not the same. You don't start out with the ambition to get that. That would be more a group 6 aspirant, and that is a problem for those at this level. Instead, it just happens more to you. Other people just notice that you've got it and they start to push you into that role. And hopefully you're ready for it, or you're going to have problems. So you're re-examining your desires to see if the little Chela is really living from a place of needs versus greeds. And slowly the little Chela simplifies these desires so others can live better lives. And in this way, the little Chela's materialistic tendencies are broken. So it's not uncommon, especially with the little Chelaship aspirant stage, still for the probationary disciple, still for the Chela and the light accepting disciple, because you don't reach the first initiation till you get through all of this, that you could fall off. We've seen how many people, how many gurus, spiritual teachers, once they're tested, down it goes. They haven't really passed these tests yet. And they're also establishing a new relationship to the physical sex nature. Desire and lust are increasingly replaced by respect and love as the sex drive assumes less focus and becomes better regulated. Now, especially for the little Chela group 6 aspirant, it's just like, let's just have it all. So we can have all the sex that we want. We can just call it Tantra yoga, which is a total distortion from what Tantra yoga really meant in the Tibetan system it was exported from, and also it was in India. I won't get into that discussion, but Tantra sex at the highest level, the Dalai Lama is one of the highest Tantra sex practitioners around, and he's a celibate. So, I'm just saying group 6 aspirant really mucks that thing up a lot. Why? Because they still want it all. I can be a spiritual guru and I can have all the money, power, sex, pleasure I want. But the probationary disciple, the little Chelaship in group 7, is starting to wonder about that, question that, and has a little bit different issues going on with sexuality, which I'll talk about in other videos. So group 7 is composed primarily in her model of little Chelaship and Chela in the light. And she uses all these different terms. As I said, it makes me nuts, but I've been doing years and years of trying to correlate these terms based on actual stuff I document from her books to prove it. The little Chelaship is the probationary disciple, and the Chela in the light is the accepting disciple. And again, mastery is not totally expected here, but the hold of the physical body and materialistic tendencies needs to be sufficiently broken before you can take that first initiation or enlightenment experience. And proof that the hold is broken does not come about by isolating yourself so you're never tempted or tested. That is a major problem of group 7 probationary disciple. Or by failing to go through the group 6 stage of becoming a front runner. That's another problem as they try and jump too much into group 7 and skip over the group 6 stages because they're distasteful or they didn't accomplish it very well, or they're lazy. It's just easier to escape from it, or they want to be judgmental about all those group 6 Wall Street one percenters out there, instead of seeing it as just a developmental stage, which, by the way, we're all supposed to get a handle on, which means if we're not learning ourselves how to be effective in the world so we can mobilize those resources for the greater good, it could be that we're more into escapism and ignoring that stage, and we've got a cleavage or gap in development at group stage than that we've actually gone through this successfully. Anyway, we're not talking about escapism because the physical world is too hard or makes you uncomfortable. We're talking about mastery, while at the same time breaking the hold of materialism. And that means that even though we isolate ourselves at times to engage in spiritual practice, you may go into a cave for 10 years, but I've studied the lives of many of the Tibetans that do that, and they're in the cave for 10 years, and then they've got to come out, start a monastery, or become a teacher, or become responsible out in the outer world, talking to groups all over the world, writing books, etc. Again, we're not meant to do spiritual practice at this stage just for ourselves. That's another big issue with group 7. They enter group meditation processes, etc., trying to get to their own enlightenment, instead of, which is what some meditation traditions actually start you out with, dedicating it, like for example in Buddhism, to the Buddha and the Sangha and the Dharma. So if you can start something I wasn't taught, so I had to learn later and grow into, but if you can start right now to look at your motive for why you're seeking out, quote, enlightenment or the first initiation, you can already begin to say that it's not for myself alone. And that would actually help you later on. Okay, now this is my general overview of everything I've done so far. And so I'm not going to use Bailey's exact words here. I will be clear when it's kind of my own thoughts coming in a little bit here so you can distinguish. But in general, again, groups 1 through 6 on the path of individualization are focused on the external world. And they've been there for millions of years. And I've already shared that they are trying to individualize in hopes of using their unique talents so they can conquer the external world enough to remove their suffering and satisfy their needs for money, security, pleasure, sex, and power. Now, I'm deliberately putting in that word, remove suffering now, because that is a big motivation as one steps into group 7. They've tried the external world method and it hasn't worked. They're still suffering, so they're going to try something else. So, though Bailey herself does not get specific in the way I'm about to, based on her teachings, I feel we can infer how the external focus works in these first 6 groups. And I'm also going to infer in this video certain cleavages or gaps in development that happen as we go along. So for example, groups 1 and 2, go watch that video if you want to learn more specifically. They are having a great deal of difficulty establishing any security in the outer world, let alone the money, the resources to get by. They are really dependent on others often. And this group, there's very few of them left. And for the most part, they would probably be institutionalized or maybe lost. I'm not saying all homeless people are in this group. The majority of them aren't, but some homeless people may be in this group. And also when we break down, if we have a cleavage in development, let's say in our early initial years. So we recapitulate groups 1 and 2 primarily until around ages maybe 3, 4, 2, 3, 4. And then we start to become more socialized and move into group 3 more. And I have a video on that. You can look at all that. But if we have a cleavage here, it's a problems of dependency, helplessness, ignorance, despair, because we simply can't survive in this outer world anymore without help. Group 3 is supposed to be the 3rd largest group in humanity. They're more consistent with getting their security and money needs met. It can still be sporadic. In that video that I did, they could maybe Bonnie and Clyde like go out and try and grab it, some of it, you know, they want it now and they don't know how to get it strategically, methodically, and through, you know, consistency and education. So they'll just go grab it as they can. They especially are interested in getting more pleasure and sex. That's a big thing for them. Their main problem is with aggression and abuse. They'll tend to get angry, to take revenge. They'll have problems with impulse control. They may be fixated on adrenal highs. You know, they want to be free, but is that true freedom or free to be dumb type of thing? And they have a difficulty understanding the difference. Again, they're individualizing. They're getting more and more individual-like. So the freedom to be my own individual is getting to be a bigger and bigger drive for them. And they especially become these ways when they can't get what they want. Getting angry, taking revenge, or you can be in group 3 and become, you know, a little bit group 1 and 2 kick in, you know, become more helpless here. Why? Because you may be being dominated by somebody who has anger and aggression and abuse issues. If you have had a childhood, and this is typically going to take you all the way up, you know, maybe up into around 12 here. If you've had a childhood, especially around ages 8, 9, 10, where you haven't gotten the needs met in a healthy way of socialization, you've either been bullied or to survive, you became a bully. You know, you've got abuse and aggression issues, or you're passive to an aggressor. You got to heal that, because that's going to affect how you approach group 7. Group 4 is more consistent at security, money, and they are more consistent in getting pleasure and sex. They got a little more money to get their fix, so to speak, but they have problems with addiction, alcohol, drugs, sex, shopping, eating, smoking. You know, any of us that have an addictive pattern. I'm still working on my sugar pattern. I was raised on sugar, massive amounts of sugar. So I'm still working on it. But anytime we notice an addictive tendency in us, it tends to be something that happened to us developmentally early on that we've got to go back and fix. And it's usually due to a feeling that we don't have enough sense of will or power over it. So we're unable to control those impulse drives, and often with group 4, we're not handling our emotions too well either. When we get to group 5, we're much more consistent at getting the security, money, and pleasure sex needs met, and we have more power. We have more respectability. In that group 5 video I did, I talked about self-esteem, but we have problems with suppression, control, cognitive dissonance, and guilt. Why? Because we're getting enough of our outer goodies met, and we're following the rule books enough that have helped us to discipline our lives enough that we're accepted socially by a group enough that we can get these needs met, and yet we screw up. We make mistakes. We bend the rules. And at this level, we don't drink it away. We may have a cleavage and go down to group 4 and drink it away. We try and hide it away. Try and pretend it's not happening, so that we don't lose our respectability. But then we have, you know, trying to control others or control ourselves overly rigorously. And this is an important one, because group 7 is going to struggle a lot with this kind of group 5 cleavage, I have found. And so we have to really learn how to work with that. Group 6, very consistent, as I said, at getting money, security, pleasure, sex, power needs met, but the problems with excess. These are problems that Bailey talks about as an integrated personality: narcissism, entitlement, control, overemphasis on the individuality, hypocrisy. My words here, hypocrisy and existential angst, but Bailey certainly has narcissism and an overemphasis on the individuality, and bombastic is one of her words, etc. Go watch that video. So, how do these groups view God? And I have to say that a little bit here, because God's going to come back into the picture in group 7. It goes out of the picture in group 6. Well, to remove suffering and maximize pleasure, these 6 groups will approach spirituality externally also. Now, this section is my ideas from my training as I understand Bailey and what she's saying, just to let you know here, this section, and I'll let you know when this section stops. So at first, God or the goddess is out there, usually represented in anthropomorphic human-like or at times animal or animal human-like form. Later, powerful human beings act as substitutes for God or the goddess in the form of royalty and in the guise of a religious hierarchy. You learn to negotiate your needs to remove suffering with them. So at first, especially in groups 1, 2, somewhat 3, you're going to be more here. Groups 4 and especially 5, you're going to be here. But by group 6, you tend to throw God out altogether, as Bailey's personality mind, which is similar to what is now known as formal operations by most psychologists, kicks in. And the individual who is approaching the mental plane, getting to the top of it, maybe is in it somewhat. You know, again, exactly where they are is my idea based upon my reading of Bailey's books. But the individual who's approaching the mental plane becomes more rational and somewhat more scientific. They tend to still have a lot of emotional bias or kickback for their particular special scientific project coming in here, but they tend to be more rational and scientific. And the external view of God is usually rejected, and agnosticism and atheism frequently are the result. And you may recapitulate that as a group 7 person. I know I did. I got to the point where I was just like, I was around 18, and I was just like, none of this stuff makes sense anymore. And I was just agnostic at that point. However, those in group 6 who tend to be the ruling elite may play upon the distorted spiritual views of groups 1 to 6 by setting themselves up as kings, queens, gods, goddesses. Why? They don't believe in it, so why do it? You know, one of my favorite series was the book Dune as I was a teenager. And in that book, they are like group 6 and they manipulate the Fremen or the Freemen. Interestingly enough, they were like a group 3 group in Dune there. So the group 6 people were manipulating the group 3 people in order to exploit the myths that they had. That series talks about it. Frank Herbert talks about how this whole getup works to help them achieve what they wanted to achieve. That is a group 6 tactic in the Bailey model. And they tend to especially rally group 3 around it. Groups 4 and 5 as well, as they play upon the idea that they are the chosen ones, they are the gods, they are the goddesses, they are either chosen as God, they either are God or they're chosen by God as a representative of God because it meets their needs. Those who are group 6 materialists, who are steeped in materialism, narcissism, and an overriding sense of selfishness, those are Bailey's words, materialism, narcissism, selfishness, will be the most likely to manipulate the masses using religion for their own ends. Group 6 aspirants are less likely to do so, but the problem with group 6 aspirants, as we learned in that video, is they set themselves up as gurus or enlightened people way too fast. And as they set themselves up, they do it in such a way that they can have it all. You know, I'm a spiritual guru with my hot yoga body who has all the money, cars, power, pleasure. I guess I'm using my hands a lot in this video. I'll try and stop. And all of this, I get to have all the sex I want, you know, because I'm doing crazy wisdom or whatever the heck they want to call it to justify it. Remember, group 6 aspirants are little cellos. They're coming into that phase, and they're much more likely to be humanitarians and are starting the process of looking within, but mainly introspection and psychology for the sake of understanding, you know, why my career got screwed up, or, you know, how come I'm not getting along with my partner or something like that, husband, wife, whatever. They're prone to narcissism. Though here's the thing with group 6 aspirants, they won't see their narcissism as much. They're overestimating themselves, but they don't see it. And they also can have an excessive emphasis on the rights of the individual over the group. And we see that going on, you know, to where I just heard something on the radio today where, you know, the airlines were starting to rule out being able to have certain pets on planes, because are they really comfort animals, or are they just really trying to escape the idea of paying the fee to transport their animal? And also, I have my right to have my pet on the plane because it comforts me. Well, what about the people that are allergic to my pet? There may be a dozen people on the plane that are allergic to my pet or have a phobia to my pet. And yet my individual right stands out above everybody else's. This is a problem with Bailey's Group 6 aspirant. Their individual rights for the sake of human rights is still selfish in a lot of ways, only they don't see it. So the antidote to suffering also for the Group 6 aspirant is an excessive emphasis on ensuring that individual rights take precedent over group rights. Though on the surface it can produce positive results, such as producing greater equality among various different races, the sexes, various points of view, there's a lot of good coming out of this stage, it still can miss the mark overall. Why? And this is why I want to bring up suffering. Because the solution to suffering still remains primarily about improving the external world. Now, it's not that we shouldn't try and improve the external world, but that the emphasis is too much on that. Now, having gone through all of that, I'm still going to use my hands. Having gone through all of that, let's shift to an internal spiritual approach, because this is a big, big shift. Big deal, big change in humanity, as Alice Bailey puts it forward. We're going internal. Eventually, the Group 6 aspirant reaches an evolutionary crisis. Having satisfied most of their external desires for money, security, pleasure, sex, and power, they realize existentially that despite all their efforts, so-called happiness still eludes them. It is at this point, that's why I went through all this, that the shift starts and the emergence into Group 7 begins, along with a more serious quest into the nature of suffering and what will bring about true happiness. You know, I read the Dalai Lama's book on the art of happiness. It wasn't at all what most of us would have considered happiness. It was about this true happiness that we're just starting to get into here. Interestingly enough, when you look at the life of Buddha, you see Buddha going through these stages. He was a prince. He had it all, wife, kids, all of that. And then saw the suffering around him, and something inside of him was saying there's more to this, and left all that life and went somewhere else. So that is an example of recapitulation in the life of Buddha. Obviously went far beyond Group 7, but when we hear that story about the Buddha wanting to renounce it all, that's like a Group 7 moment where that shift is taking place. Unlike the little Chela aspirant who's approaching spirituality in order to get all the external goodies they want, the little Chela probationary disciple takes a different approach. Why? You're no longer so focused on the external. The internal realms are occupying more and more of your attention. The path of initiation has begun, or to use a Christian phrase, the probationary disciple is seeking the kingdom of God within. And when you read Christianity in this inner way, you understand what is meant by that phrase, that the kingdom of God is within you. It's that internal quest. So what is the Group 7 probationary disciple? Remember, it also includes the Chel and the light accepting disciple, but what is the Group 7 probationary disciple being initiated into? The mysteries of who they really are as something beyond human. You're no longer becoming human, you're becoming soul. What does that mean? Using Bailey terminology, he is attempting a self-initiated process of discovering the soul while actively trying to become what Bailey calls, again, we talked about that, the soul-infused personality. Now, that's important to understand. You're not being initiated by somebody putting you through some sort of ritual and then, they bestow some initiation upon you. This is a developmental process where you initiate yourself by doing the practices and proving to yourself that those practices are every day. You're initiating yourself by yourself. by doing the work until eventually the mold, the clay, is shaped in such a way that the rod of initiation, as Bailey calls it, is basically the fire that sets the mold. You're like put in the oven and the mold is set. It's like you've reached a certain percentage, so to speak, of your habit patterns, and your consciousness is habituated along these lines so that the mold is set. And here, the hard-won individuality of the personality is retained, but that personality is now infused with soul qualities, such as wisdom, love, compassion, discernment, the spiritual use of the will, an ability to create what Bailey calls a synthesis. Now, she was talking about an avatar of synthesis is coming into our planet. Again, a lot of our language sounds strange unless you read it symbolically, which increasingly the aspirant's starting to do, but the probationary group 7 disciple is doing even more. You're learning to read symbolically. So the avatar of synthesis is now that word. I used to have that on my license plate, synthesis. But now it was synthsis, I think is what I had for mine. But anyway, now it's integral is the new phrase that's really being used, an integral understanding, whether it was the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo or the integral yoga of Swami Satchidananda, or now the integral movement. Bailey used a similar word, only her word was synthesis. You create what Bailey calls a synthetic understanding of many different points of view and much more. So none of this process can begin in earnest until you've gone through the stage of little Chelaship aspirant, which requires, as I was saying, being able to read symbolically and not literally, so that the unseen realms can begin to be penetrated into. As we have seen, the aspirant aspires to the spiritual path, but is rarely willing to do the real work. The probationary disciple is more willing to do that real work, but too frequently falls back into personality tendencies where selfishness rears its head again. They are on probation, after all, a word which implies they can still get off course. Now, I'm not doing the group 6 aspirant video. Go back and look at it. But essentially, I want to say we had 4 components in that video that we talked about. The ability to do spiritual reading. And again, that can include being able to penetrate and read, the elements that are existing from a scientific level. You're getting into the interior realms, as well as to read symbolically something like the Quran or the Bible, or even the Dhammapada isn't always read spiritually in a symbolic way, etc. You're starting to cast at the aspirant level a fiery light on your issues. You're starting to introspect, but as I said, not necessarily in the ways that we're going to see in a moment with the probationer. You're learning more about energy. You may get into the chakras, or you may, get into the different nadis and get into acupuncture or something like that, the energy body. You're learning about it, but again, it's rudimentary. You're starting to understand that there might be this thing called a soul or super soul, and you're starting to obey it within, but this is all still really touch and go. And it's especially go if you have to give up too much. Here, they're not too willing to do that. Finally, we're getting to more specifically the probationary disciple. What are its main themes? And I'm going to do a video on each one of these themes. A more sincere quest to seek the higher self. A pull between the two worlds of the external, internal worlds and the soul and the personality. Trying to purify the lower self of the personality, especially in the body and in the emotions. Beginning to see the mind and its conditioning and how it works. Higher versus lower psychism, which was a big thing that Bailey talks about in her books, especially related to this stage. I'm now going to give a brief overview of these. Seeking the higher self. And again, there's so much written about group 7. I'm going to do a separate video, I hope, on each of these categories. So I'm just highlighting rapidly some of the significant things here. The probationary disciple is still approaching the self in a dualistic manner. Remember in that quote on group 7, we talked about the duality. Though the self may no longer be referred to as God, it's not an anthropomorphic kind of figure out there. It's still frequently talked about now as a higher self or a soul or a super soul or the force be with you or spirit. And it's still seen as like out there, separate from you, which is fine. This is the stage here. And the probationer is using methods to find that self. And the methods are more internal methods. And eventually the contradiction between a self out there and in here will be resolved, but not at group 7. That is much farther down the path. Right now, it is important to see the methods the probationer is using to find that self as useful, even though they are preliminary. And in that video, we're going to go into those methods much more, but the primary method is going to be meditation. They are pulled between the two worlds. Having spent so much time focused on the world of the 5 senses, as I said earlier, they live in a world of contradictions between the external and internal worlds. And that can lead to numerous difficulties. And Bailey has really talked a lot about them, especially 4 specifically that I will bring up in my videos. And she also gives advice about how the probationer can get out of this dilemma of the pull between these two worlds and these 4 particular problems that they move into in regarding this pull. But what often happens is that the probationer attempts to give up the external world and leads a lifestyle of escapism that is not very helpful. That can even be escape through highs, through drugs, through what's now called state experiences, etc. Now, in her model, there's not necessarily something wrong with doing that. It's just, it's not going to get you in the same places where you're going to understand and control that process. Bailey did a commentary in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and book 3 of the Yoga Sutras talks about these same problems, and Bailey talks about it there as well. The idea is to have conscious control over these inner worlds. And a drug experience can just kind of take you there. It can help you realize things. It can help you awaken to other realms. It can help you heal things. It can help further you on the path. But if you have a group 4 cleavage, it's going to make you addicted. Or if you have a group 7 escapism problem, you're just going to go off into your pot parties all the time and you're just not going to get much done in the world. And you're going to confuse that with what is really required on group 7 here. The internal world can also seem unrewarding at first, causing the probationary disciple to seek out spiritual highs instead of mature spiritual growth. Now, Bailey actually talked about these 2 things in her books. Now, in the integral movement, the idea between states and stages is like really big, but that existed already in Bailey's model. And as we are learning, she had quite an elaborate stage model already developed. And again, we're talking about a woman that did this when women didn't even have the right to vote. And the big psychology deal was super ego and id. So to me, that says an awful lot about this model and what she was putting forward. So the probationer may get caught up in phenomena, or here's another one, drop the spiritual path altogether because it's just too hard. And maybe go back to group 6 aspirant where I can get all the goodies and enjoy all the pleasure, sex, drugs, power, cars, whatever I want, and not have to make any real disciplined sacrifices here. And that's the next one, purifying the lower self, including the motives of the lower self. Again, it's known as the path of purification, the path of initiation, where the little Chela, group 6 aspirant, their emphasis is on mainly purifying the physical body so they can look hot. I already talked about that. But they rarely examine their deeper motives for being on the path. And that's why they often get into trouble. So does the group 7 person, but the group 6 person more so. Because the group 7 person is a little more honestly motivated to clean their act up. The probationary discipleship stage of little Chelaship recognizes from that spiritual path, that's a badly written sentence, recognizes from that The spiritual path needs to be approached in a less selfish way. I think I was saying recognizes from the lessons of the previous paragraph that the spiritual path needs to be approached in a less selfish way. Still, the probationer frequently approaches the path as wanting to gain initiation or enlightenment for oneself. We've talked about that already. The spiritual path is still viewed too much as an individual path. Why? You've come out of how long on the path of individualization, where becoming the individual was the point. You know, so it makes sense that you're doing that. Now, you're going to shift out of that on the path of initiation into something Bailey calls group consciousness. But group consciousness isn't where you give up the individual self. It's just you learn how to get along with groups within groups within groups within larger groups. Remember, you can't skip the stage of the integrated personality having to integrate into the external world. Group 7 is going to try and do that. But especially as you get into groups 8 and especially 9 and 10, you're in the world and not of it. You're able and capable to make a difference in the world without getting, caught up in the cleavages or gaps that are going to bring you down and screw things, your service activity up. You're able to be of use in the world. You can't just run away from that, which group 7 people try to do a lot. As for some of the purifications that are taking place for the group 7 probationary disciple, they are first and foremost along the lines of an increased obsession with physical purity. And Bailey talks also about how not only hatha yoga, she uses these words, but vegetarianism becomes like the big fixation, and the return to physical fitness. We'll also see the whole thing on energy work, frequently emphasized, often to excess. Now, all of this is good and healthy. And in fact, in Bailey's rules for the road, on the probationary discipleship path, she recommends vegetarianism. Later, she says it's not always important. And we'll explain that why later when we get more into group 8. But it is important that you clean that up, especially if you're trying to clean up your energy channels. She talks about this. If you're trying to shift from lower to higher psychic powers, vegetarianism is a recommended diet. The rules of the road that she puts forward, and I'll do a video on that probably, are suggested. They're suggested because you're less likely to have problems if you follow them. But a certain fanaticism may kick in here, where the people that aren't vegetarian, or the people that can't do the certain hatha yoga poses, or the people that don't look physically fit, where there's a judgment that maybe they're not really where we think they should be, type of thing. And I've been guilty of that myself here. Some increased work on looking at and purifying the emotions is also going on, and the motivations is going on. Starting to understand emotions, starting to understand our emotional reactions, starting to even notice our emotional reactions more and more is happening here, according to Bailey. And seeing the mind. Begin to undergo a more rigorous internal focus. So he is more consciously exposed to the realm of the mind. You close your eyes, you go inside, and you begin to see and understand certain things, both through mindfulness meditation, which is part of that process by just watching the thoughts, observing the thoughts. That's a big step. But going beyond that, starting to understand thoughts. Frequently, I'll go back to my reading here. Frequently, the probationer discovers that he has little to no control over the mind. Now, I've been in a number of meditation practices where people were saying to me, oh, you just watch the thoughts, don't try and control them. Well, and even suggest to me that it was impossible to control the thoughts. Well, all I can say is the meditation practices I was involved in of Raja Yoga, especially that I was doing more rigorously in my 20s, it was very possible to control and still and calm the thoughts and get them concentrated to the point where no other thoughts would come in and distract me. So I know that from my own experience, let alone having seen and read about others that do it. But at first, yes, the thoughts jump all over the place and wander about restlessly, for example. And you can, be really good at that and then drop out of that if other things in life are coming along and you've got other cleavages or gaps to deal with. You can lose that ability and have to go back and regain it. You haven't stabilized there yet. Another thing that probationer is discovering is how the mind is conditioned with the thoughts of his country, culture, society, family, religion, education, whatever you've been indoctrinated into. You have to start as a probationary disciple at group 7 to observe and try and understand, where do these ideas come from? As the probationer sees this, he needs to more carefully examine whether that conditioning is serving your consciousness or not anymore on the spiritual path. You have to tend to become more inclusive in your thinking. You have to, Bailey talks about this, achieve more equanimity in your emotional responses to things, more objectivity and emotional equanimity. Your ability to do that, especially when you're in a lot of groups that are different from you, is not, you probably won't be really good at that as a group 7 person. You'll be practicing it more, but later on, especially by groups 9 and 10, you better be really good at that, or you're not going to get much accomplished in the world with all the different groups and points of views and ways of thinking that you're going to be exposed to. And this was a big deal in the Bailey books, the difference between higher and lower psychism. Finally, Bailey stresses how the probationary disciple is frequently getting lost in what she calls lower psychism. The reason for this is that the little Chela probationer is trying to understand and explore the inner realms. Subtle and psychic phenomena will capture his attention, did mine. Lower psychism can include things like ESP, fortune telling, channeling, occult powers, and so forth. And she writes a lot on these things, especially on different ways to view channeling. I'll do a video on that, etc. So you can really get into understanding these things, writing books on these things, practicing these things. That's okay. It's part of the internal world, and we're learning. And we may get it right. We may make mistakes. We may have to adjust our focus later on. That's all okay. But there's a higher psychism. All this may be interesting, but because group 7 probationer lacks true discernment, understanding, and a true scientific approach to these inner realms, these lower psychic powers frequently become a distraction. Now, maybe you're, Institute of Noetic Sciences comes to mind. Maybe you're approaching this from a more scientific viewpoint. That's fine. That's probably more what I would call, group 7, group 8 kind of work here. We're not really scientists, Bailey says, until we're in group 8 and are accepted disciples. That's where true scientific ability really arises, that is more freed from emotional bias and distortion. So until then, group 7, we're likely to get caught up in these inner worlds and have plenty of bias and distortion and not really care so much about the scientific approach to these things. Can we really prove that we have those psychic powers, that those occult powers work? And here's what's more important. Compared to the higher psychism, are they really that important? Because what Bailey calls higher psychism rarely appeals to little Chelas, as group 6 aspirants and group 7 probationers. In the Chelaship stages, this is more the occupation of the Chela on the thread, these higher psychic powers. What are they? Well, they're not very glamorous. Bailey describes them as discernment. How many of us think about the ability to have keen discernment as a psychic power? Probably none of us. Compassion. We just think that's just something we're supposed to do. We don't consider that a higher psychic power. Being a true healer in the world, offering what she calls beatitude, being a blessing to others. Those phrases seem too ordinary to most of us. And they don't seem as glamorous. They don't seem as fun. They won't let us get the goodies as much as maybe the psychic powers do. And so in truth, these higher psychic powers actually are much harder to develop. And there's a lot of humility that has to happen when you start to realize this. So for example, you may be able to tell somebody as a psychic, yes, your husband is cheating on you. So what? What good is that? How's that going to help that person develop spiritually? How is that person going to develop an understanding of why is the husband cheating? How do I have compassion if the husband's cheating? How do I have discernment and say goodbye to the husband if the husband's cheating? I mean, these are things that require thought, which is why we're on the mental plane more than the emotional plane, and introspection and examination and true understanding of what's going on in ourselves and those around us so that we can have right action and make right decisions. Those are the higher psychic powers. And group 7, Probationary Disciple, is just beginning to figure this out. So we've reached the last slide here. And as I've said before, and I've kind of hinted at already in these videos, we don't just go in a step ladder, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we put the groups up. We just don't go like group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, group 5, all the way up to 10. It's not like that. It's more like this game. It's called Chutes and Ladders when I played it as a kid. Before that, it was known as Snakes and Ladders. It's more like this game where we go up and then maybe we go down. Or here's a fun one. We go up and then, oh my gosh, here we go down. And then, oh no, here we go really down. It's an up and down process. Why? Because as is used in the Bailey model, there are cleavages or gaps, which I am summarizing as follows. In groups 1 and 2, it'll be something about abandonment issues we haven't resolved. And it can also be about despair. And in a moment, I'll show it can also be about something that accidentally happens and affects our brains. Group 3, the biggest problem tends to be a cleavage of abuse. These are my words that I'm using here. Group 4, addiction. Group 5, that cognitive dissonance. Group 6 is narcissism. This is a big thing in the Bailey model. At the height in group 6, we get pretty narcissistic. Go watch those videos. And that's the cream of humanity. Didn't make me feel too hopeful with this model to know that that's where we're headed. More and more narcissism. Yay! But there are millions of group 7 coming in, but they have to avoid escapism. And I'm going to do groups 8, 9, and 10 of my keywords for them later as we get to those groups. But these are some of my quick little keywords of the summarizing some of the gaps or cleavages we have to watch out for. So for example, we may be moving into group 7. Here we are. This is kind of going up to group 7, 8, 9, and 10. So this is like the group 7 level here. We've jumped up from group 6 to group 7. Good for us. But then we get too much spiritual recognition. Actually, I guess it goes like this, but I'm going the wrong way. Just follow along with me for example's sake. We get too much spiritual recognition and we slip back due to our selfish tendencies back into group 6. Why? Because we were starting to get the goodies and we started to manipulate others for our own gain. And then we keep going. And unfortunately, as we start to climb up again, we may hit this one. And maybe our excessive behavior led to brain damage. Why? Because maybe there was too much sex, drugs, rock and roll as we're trying to be that spiritual guru. And we ended up debilitating our brains. Go watch the work of Dr. Amen and his SPECT scans to get some wonderful videos of what we can do to our hardware and our software, our brains, and what we're putting into that contents of consciousness here. And we can drop all the way back down into here. And then we're going to have to build our way back up by going and doing the psychological work. She was trying to create the spiritual psychology. Go do the psychological work of your abandonment issues, your abuse issues, your addiction issues, the cognitive dissonance, got to look good even though I'm not, the narcissism, the escapism. You've got to heal all this if you're going to stabilize on these levels and not drop. So that's the intro. As usual, a lot longer than I thought it would be. But I'm doing my best. So if you are enjoying these videos and you want to support this work, best thing you can do is subscribe to this channel. That way you'll know when new videos come out. These videos are getting harder to do. There's a lot of information I have to put into it, and they're not coming out weekly like they used to. They're coming out more monthly. I hope they stay that way. But subscribe to the channel if you want to become alerted to when the next video is out. And you can become a Patreon to help me with this work. It is a lot of work. I am doing this all for free at this point. And that's the link to my Patreon, Wise Productions Inc., so that you can support this work. And I have some gifts for you if you do. Thank you so much. I'm Dr. Lisa Love. We'll see you next time.